This video is created for educational and awareness purposes only. All events are based.
6 hours. That's how long it took a king to die. Not in a palace, not surrounded by guards, but on a gurney inside Mount Sinai, a hospital on Chicago's west side. 3 bullet wounds working through what was left of him, 1 in the head, 1 in neck, 1 in the shoulder, while outside on Roosevelt and Sacramento. The blood was already drying on the sidewalk in front of a mini-mart that, by tomorrow, would just be another corner nobody talked about out loud. On October 14th, 1986, the man they called King Neil, sometimes spelled King Neil, walked out of that store like he had 1,000 times before. He never saw it coming, and when the title died with him that night, it never got picked back up again. Not by anybody. For decades after, kids who weren't even born yet would still spray his name on brick walls across North Lawndale and Austin, not because they knew the man, but because the legend had already outgrown him. This is the story of how a teenage baseball player from a broken-up gang of church corner kids became the only man in the history of the traveling Vice Lords to ever wear the crown, and reportedly, how the very loyalty that put him on the throne is what got him buried in it. To understand how Neil Wallace became king, you have to go back to a church that had nothing to do with any of it. Zion Travelers Church, 2009, 138 West Flournoy Street, East Garfield Park, 1962. A group of black teenagers, some as young as 11, were gathering on the corner of California and Flournoy, not because they were plotting anything, but because there was nowhere else for them to go. A 16-year-old named Thomas Diablo Wells reportedly gave the group its name with a single sentence that would end up defining an entire criminal organization for the next 60 years. From now on, we travelers, and we'll travel anywhere to stomp a motherfucker in the dirt. That was it. That was the founding document. No charter, no ceremony, just a threat that stuck. The Vice Lords already ruled East Garfield Park by then, but these kids, calling themselves the Travelers, refused to answer to anybody. It's a detail that gets lost in most retellings of Chicago gang history. The group that would eventually produce one of the most beloved kings the West Side ever saw started out as a group of children who didn't want a king at all. Leadership moved fast in those early years. Thomas Wells handed control to Darius Ray Charles Edwards in 1967, and by the late 60s, the Travelers were assembling their own baseball teams. First, the question marks, then a second squad, simply called the Travelers. It's easy to laugh at that detail now, a street gang with a baseball league, but it mattered. It gave structure to boys who had none. And sometime during this period, a kid named Neil Wallace, born April 3, 1956, quietly joined the group. Nobody was watching him yet. He was just another face on the roster, another glove in the outfield. Nobody could have known that this same kid, 2 decades later, would combine those very same baseball teams into a single club called California Gold, a name that, by 1992, would be competing in a national tournament in La Crosse, Wisconsin, years after Wallace himself was already in the ground. In 1970, the Travelers formally connected with the Holy City conservative Vice Lords and were granted an official charter into the broader Vice Lord nation. That's the moment the name changed for good. Travelers became Traveling Vice Lords, TVL, and the crew staked permanent territory in North Lawndale, around California and Roosevelt, the exact same intersection, reportedly, where Neil Wallace would take his last breath 16 years later. If you believe in omens, that's one worth sitting with. The neighborhood that made him is the neighborhood that killed him, and the corner that built his legend is the corner that ended it. Through the 70s, TVL expanded the way every serious Chicago gang expanded in that era. Through migration, through drug turf, through sheer numbers of displaced black families moving in neighborhoods the white population was abandoning. West Humboldt Park in 1975. Austin starting in 1976, a stretch that would eventually become one of TVL's most permanent strongholds, a neighborhood where, according to Chicago gang historians, Neil Wallace himself reportedly helped coordinate the earliest TVL settlement at Division and Central. He wasn't the boss yet. He was, as one gang history source puts it, a rising star, respected, but not yet royalty. Rockwell Gardens fell to TVL influence starting in 1979, becoming one of the largest and most profitable strongholds the gang would ever control, generating what court documents would later put at somewhere between $5,000 and $30,000 a day in drug sales by the 1990s. Altgeld Gardens, on the far south side, followed in 1981. This wasn't a street crew anymore. This was an organization with the geographic reach of a small corporation, and it needed a leader who could hold all of it together without the whole thing tearing itself apart from the inside. That's the vacancy Neil Wallace stepped into. In 1980 or 1981, the exact year is disputed, which tells you something about how quietly the transition actually happened. Ray Charles Edwards stepped down from leadership, and in a vote among the TVL elders, the position was handed to Wallace. He was in his mid-20s. It was, by every surviving account, not a hostile takeover or a violent coup. It was a vote of confidence from the older generation, men who had built the organization from a church, corner crew, and needed someone they trusted to carry it forward. And Wallace didn't just accept the position, he was given a title that no leader before or after him in TVL history would ever hold again. They called him King of Kings, Lord of Lords, King Neil. Now here's where the story stops fitting the template. If you've watched enough of these documentaries, and Danny, you already know this better than anybody, you expect the King era to be a body count, a war chronicle, a rise built entirely on fear. But what actually happened in North Lawndale and Austin under King Neil Wallace was, reportedly, something closer to a cultural renaissance than a reign of terror. Wallace brought hip-hop into the neighborhood before it was commercially viable anywhere outside of New York. Years before Run DMC or the Sugar Hill Gang would be household names on Chicago's West Side, he ran a free breakfast program that fed kids who weren't even TVL, kids whose only connection to Wallace was that they lived on the same 6 blocks he controlled. He owned a record store and a game room, and inside that record store, he hosted break-dancing competitions, a king presiding over dance battles in a neighborhood that the city itself had all but abandoned. He reportedly pushed his own members toward college degrees and legitimate entrepreneurship, an instruction that runs directly against everything the outside world assumes a gang leader is supposed to want from his soldiers. Was Neil Wallace a saint? No. He ran a criminal enterprise that moved serious weight and answered to nobody but the elders who crowned him. But according to those who lived under his reign, he was not, in the words of one gang historian, a sawed-off evil gangster destroying the community. He was something far more complicated and far more dangerous to the mythology true crime documentaries usually sell you. A king who built as much as he broke, but kings don't get to choose which wars find them. And by October of 1986, a war had already found King Neil, one that reportedly had nothing to do with territory or disrespect, and everything to do with money. The traveling Vice Lords had gotten into a dispute with the Albany Vice Lords, another Vice Lord Nation faction, over what's been described as a bad drug deal, the kind of dispute that happens 1,000 times a year in a business with no contracts and no courts to settle a debt. At the center of it was King Neil's chief enforcer, a man known as Jetty Bo Diddley Williams. Whatever happened in that dispute, it escalated to a killing Bo Diddley was, according to court records, eventually convicted of murdering a member of the Albany Vice Lords known as Lucky. And in the closed, retaliatory logic of Chicago's gang economy, that killing didn't end the conflict. It just moved the target. It moved it, reportedly, straight to the king himself. Picture the morning of October 14th, 1986. Nothing separates it from any other morning in North Lawndale. Neil Wallace, 30 years old, is at a mini-mart at the corner of Roosevelt and Sacramento. The same corner, the same neighborhood, where TVL had planted its first permanent flag 16 years earlier. He walks outside, and whoever was waiting for him didn't hesitate. 3 shots, head, neck, shoulder. 6 hours later, at Mount Sinai Hospital, Neil Wallace was pronounced dead. No trial ever definitively closed the loop connecting his murder to the Bo Diddley conflict with the Albany Vice Lords. That link remains, in the historical record, a reported one built from pattern and proximity rather than a courtroom verdict naming his actual killer. That gap, that unresolved thread, is exactly the kind of hole that swallows a story whole, and it's the kind of hole this channel exists to sit inside of. What happened after his death is, in some ways, more remarkable than the killing itself. The title of king simply ended. Nobody replaced him. Nobody was crowned. According to Chicago gang historians who have documented TVL's full history, the rank of king died with Neil Wallace on October 14, 1986, and it has never been reissued in the almost 4 decades since. Think about what that actually means inside a criminal organization, a title that powerful, that symbolically loaded, and the entire structure decided, implicitly or explicitly, that nobody else deserved to hold it. For years afterward, through the late 80s and into the 90s, his name kept appearing on walls across the West Side. King Neil, King Neil. A spray painted not as a warning, but as a memorial. A generation of traveling vice lords who never met him grew up under his name anyway. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Gang historians who have spent years cataloging Chicago's street history point out that young travelers today are more likely to know who King Neil was than young gangster disciples are to know who Larry Hoover is. A man with a federal case, national headlines, and a name that's been in the news for decades. Neil Wallace never had any of that. He had a mini-mart, a record store, and 30 years of life, and somehow that was enough to outlast a legend built on federal indictments. There's a version of this story that ends there, clean and closed. But it doesn't actually end there, because the very thing that made Wallace's rule possible, the loyalty of his enforcer, the willingness of Bo Diddley Williams to go to war over a bad drug deal, is reportedly the same loyalty that got him killed. It's the paradox sitting underneath every gang hierarchy this channel has ever covered. The men closest to a king are the ones who protect his crown, and the ones most likely to drag him into the exact conflict that ends up taking his life. Bo Diddley's war became King Neil's war, whether Wallace ever wanted it or not. That's what it means to sit on a throne you didn't build from nothing. You inherit not just the loyalty, but the enemies that loyalty makes for you. Even now, decades later, there are questions about October 14th, 1986, that have never been fully answered in the public record. Who exactly pulled the trigger at Roosevelt and Sacramento has never been definitively established in the reporting available on this case. A detail that, if it exists in a case file somewhere in Cook County, has never surfaced publicly. Whether the Albany Vice Lords ordered the hit as direct retaliation for the murder of Lucky, or whether it was carried out independently by someone settling a personal score under the cover of that larger conflict, remains, by every available account, allegedly true rather than proven. What we do know is what the neighborhood knew immediately, that the king was dead, that the title wasn't coming back, and that whatever Neil Wallace had built in that record store, on that baseball diamond in that breakfast line, was not going to survive contact with the very organization that made him powerful enough to build it in the first place. To really understand the weight of what Neil Wallace inherited in 1980, you have to understand what the traveling Vice Lords actually were by that point. Not a single crew on a single corner, but a sprawling multi-neighborhood machine that had been assembling itself for almost 2 decades before he ever touched the crown. Before TVL was TVL, there was a splinter inside a splinter. Thomas Diablo, Wells's original travelers, weren't even the only crew claiming that corner of the West Side. Earl Frank, founder of the California Vice Lords and a man with real standing inside the older Vice Lord structure, had personally blessed the formation of the Travelers as a satellite chapter, meaning the group that would eventually produce King Neil was, from its very first breath, a legitimate branch of a much older criminal tree, not some rogue offshoot operating outside the rules. Frank ran the Travelers until 1966, when he handed control to Wells. Wells lasted only 9 months before relocating to Evanston, and the reins went to Darius Ray Charles Edwards in 1967, the same man who, over a decade later, would step aside and clear the path for Wallace. That's 4 leadership changes before Neil Wallace ever wore a title. 4 different men, 4 different eras, each one adding territory, adding numbers, adding enemies. By the time the group formally chartered into the Vice Lord Nation in 1970 and planted its flag in North Lawndale around California and Roosevelt, TVL already had a reputation for exactly what its name promised: traveling. Unlike gangs that stayed locked to a single set of blocks, TVL pushed outward constantly, chasing territory in West Humboldt Park, in Austin, in the crumbling public housing towers of Rockwell Gardens, in Altgeld Gardens on the far south side, even out into the western suburbs of Maywood and Bellwood by 1980. Each new territory meant new alliances, new rivalries, and new bodies of men who now answered, at least nominally, to whoever sat at the top. When Neil Wallace took that seat, he wasn't just inheriting a gang. He was inheriting a small nation spread across a dozen neighborhoods with revenue streams that court documents would later peg in the tens of thousands of dollars a day just from a single stretch of Rockwell Gardens. And this is where the contradiction at the heart of King Neil's story gets sharper, not softer. A man who inherited that scale of operation, that many soldiers, that much money, that many rival factions circling for a piece of it, is not a man who can simply decide to run a peaceful kingdom. Every dollar moving through TVL territory in the 1980s was a dollar somebody else wanted. Every alliance Wallace maintained with conservative Vice Lords in Altgeld Gardens, every truce with the 4 corner hustlers that would later formalize into the so-called double solid, packed inside Rockwell Gardens, existed because violence was always sitting one bad deal away. Wallace didn't rule by accident of good timing. He ruled inside one of the most volatile drug economies on the west side of Chicago, and reportedly, he ruled it by keeping the peace between factions that had every reason to turn on each other the moment the money got tight. That's part of what makes the community facing side of his reign so hard to reconcile with the world he actually operated in. The free breakfast program on California Avenue wasn't charity for its own sake. In neighborhoods gutted by disinvestment, where the city had functionally abandoned basic services, that breakfast line was, for some kids, the only meal guaranteed before school. The record store wasn't just a hangout. It was infrastructure, a legitimate-looking storefront that doubled as a cultural anchor, pulling kids toward break-dancing competitions and early hip-hop instead of whatever else the block had to offer them. Wallace, according to those who remember him, pushed his own soldiers toward college and legitimate business ownership, an instruction that runs completely counter to the incentives of enterprise. He was simultaneously running underneath it. He was, by every surviving account, playing two roles at once: a king feeding his kingdom, and a king financing that kingdom through exactly the kind of transactions that eventually killed him. Because make no mistake, the empire Wallace built in the early 80s needed enforcement, and enforcement in that world always has a name attached to it. His was Jetty Bo Diddley Williams, chief enforcer of the traveling Vice Lords, the man tasked with making sure disputes over territory, over product, over disrespect, got settled in TVL's favor. For most of the decade, that arrangement worked exactly the way it was supposed to, quietly, efficiently, with just enough fear attached to Bo Diddley's name to keep most conflicts from ever escalating into headlines. But by 1986, something had shifted. A drug deal with the Albany Vice Lords, another faction flying the same broader Vice Lord Nation banner, theoretically an ally, at least on paper, went bad. Nobody outside that room knows exactly what bad meant: a shorted payment, a stolen shipment, a disrespected messenger. The specifics never made it into the public record, and this channel isn't going to manufacture a version of events that sounds cleaner than what's actually known. What is known is the outcome. Bo Diddley Williams was, according to court records, eventually convicted of murdering a member of the Albany Vice Lords known only as Lucky. In the closed economy of Chicago gang retaliation, a murder like that doesn't end a conflict. It reopens one, wider and angrier than before. Somewhere in the weeks after Lucky's death, the war stopped being about a bad drug deal and started being about blood. And in that world, the man whose name sat at the top of the organization, even a man who ran breakfast programs, even a man who bankrolled a record store, becomes, whether he asked for it or not, the most valuable target on the board. Killing an enforcer sends a message. Killing a king ends a reign. By early October of 1986, Neil Wallace had been the undisputed king of the traveling Vice Lords for roughly 6 years. 6 years of expansion, 6 years of alliances, 6 years of a title nobody else in TVL history had ever carried, and nobody after him ever would. He was 30 years old. He had built a record store, sponsored a baseball team that would go on to compete nationally years after his death, and reportedly kept the peace across a footprint that stretched from North Lawndale to Rockwell Gardens to Altgeld Gardens on the far south side. And on the morning of October 14th, none of that mattered. He was just a man walking out of a mini-mart at Roosevelt and Sacramento, the exact intersection where TVL had planted its very first permanent flag back in 1970, the corner that made the gang what it was. Whoever was waiting for him didn't hesitate and didn't miss. 3 shots, head, neck, shoulder, fired in what witnesses would later describe, according to gang historians who have documented the case, as a matter of seconds. Wallace went down outside the store he'd probably walked past 1,000 times without a second thought. He was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital. For 6 hours, doctors worked to save a man whose entire kingdom was built on being untouchable. And for 6 hours, the neighborhood that loved him waited to hear whether the king would survive. He didn't. At some point that afternoon or evening, Neil Wallace was pronounced dead, and with him, by every account TVL history has preserved since, died the title of king itself. No definitive public record ever named the shooter who pulled the trigger that morning. No court case ever closed the loop tying Wallace's assassination directly to Bo Diddley's war with the Albany Vice Lords. That connection remains, in the fullest honesty this channel can offer, a reported one, built from timeline and motive rather than a courtroom verdict. It's entirely possible the man who murdered King Neil was never charged with that specific killing at all, buried instead inside some other case, some other plea, some other file in the Cook County system that never got cross, referenced back to October 14, 1986. That's the hole at the center of this story, and it's a hole that, decades later, still hasn't been filled. What happened next says almost everything you need to know about what Neil Wallace actually meant to the people who followed him. Nobody was crowned. Nobody stepped into the vacuum and claimed the title for themselves. In a criminal organization where rank is currency, where every ambitious soldier is theoretically one violent move away from climbing the ladder, the traveling Vice Lords simply let the position die. According to Chicago gang historians who have spent years documenting TVL's full lineage, the rank of king has never been reissued in the 38 years since Wallace's murder, not by his own crew, not by any splinter faction, not by anyone claiming legitimate succession. That kind of restraint doesn't happen by accident inside an organization built on hierarchy. It happens because the men who buried Neil Wallace understood that whatever he'd built couldn't be inherited. It could only be remembered, and remembered it was, through the late 80s and well into the 90s, King Neil kept appearing on walls across North Lawndale and Austin, not gang tags marking territory, but something closer to a memorial repeated in spray paint, generation after generation, by travelers who had never met the man they were honoring. Gang historians who track this kind of cultural memory point to a detail that should stop any true crime audience cold. Young travelers today are more likely to know exactly who King Neil was than young gangster disciples are to know who Larry Hoover is, a man with federal indictments, national news coverage, and decades of headlines behind his name. Wallace never had any of that machinery working for his legacy. He had a corner store, a record shop, and a breakfast line. And somehow, that outlasted everything Hoover's name has accumulated in the decades since. There's a temptation, telling a story like this, to flatten it into something simple. A good king or a bad king, a martyr or a menace. The truth, sitting underneath King Neil Wallace's story, refuses that flattening. He ran a criminal enterprise that moved serious weight across multiple Chicago neighborhoods and generated, according to court documents connected to TVL's later operations, tens of thousands of dollars a day in a single housing project alone. He also reportedly fed children who weren't his responsibility, funded a cultural space that brought hip-hop to a neighborhood before the rest of the city had caught on, and pushed his own soldiers toward futures outside the very organization that made him powerful. Both of those things were true at the same time, inside the same 6-year reign, inside the same 30-year-old man who bled out over 6 hours at Mount Sinai Hospital because loyalty to Enforcers' War became a debt he never got the chance to refuse paying. The organization Wallace left behind didn't collapse without him. If anything, it kept growing, which makes the absence of his title even harder to explain away as simple grief. 2 years after his death, in 1988, TVL's leadership inside Rockwell Gardens formalized an alliance with the Four Corner Hustlers that would come to be known as Double Solid. A TVL claiming the name Tall T, the Hustlers claiming Macateers and Maniac, both factions agreeing to stand solid for one another inside those buildings. It strengthened drug operations between the two gangs for years afterward. By the 1990s, when Fly came home from military service and linked up with Angelo Roberts of the Four Corner Hustlers, the two of them built what's been described as the largest drug operation Rockwell Gardens had ever witnessed, flipping members of the gangster disciples, the conservative Vice Lords, and the gangster Stones under that same Double Solid banner, even after Roberts himself was killed in 1995. TVL's reach by then had grown far beyond Chicago, with chapters reportedly operating in cities like Memphis and North Carolina. The Memphis chapter eventually appearing on the television show Gangland. None of that expansion required a king. The machine Wallace built kept running on the structure he left behind: the alliances, the territory, the discipline, but the crown itself stayed exactly where it was left, empty, on a corner in North Lawndale. That's the detail that separates King Neil's story from almost every other Chicago gang biography this channel has covered. Usually, when a leader falls, somebody else rises within months, sometimes within weeks, because the position itself is too valuable to leave vacant. Power abhors a vacuum, and criminal hierarchies are no exception to that rule anywhere else in this city's history. But TVL broke that pattern for Neil Wallace, and only for Neil Wallace. Ray Charles Edwards had been a leader. Thomas Wells had been a leader. Earl Frank had been a leader. None of them were ever called king. That title and everything it represented, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, belonged to one man for 6 years, and then belonged to no one forever. It raises a question this channel can't fully answer, and won't pretend to. Was the title retired out of respect or out of fear? Did the elders who elevated Wallace in 1980 make an unspoken decision that nobody currently living had earned the right to follow him? Or did the manner of his death, a king gunned down outside a corner store over a subordinate's drug dispute, make the position itself feel cursed? Something no ambitious soldier actually wanted to claim. The historical record doesn't say. What it does say, repeatedly, across decades of graffiti and oral history, passed down through generations of travelers who never met him, is that the name stuck. Long after the men who actually knew Neil Wallace had aged out of the streets or gone to prison or died themselves, his name kept getting sprayed onto walls by kids who'd only ever heard the story. Secondhand, the king who ran a record store, who fed the neighborhood, who bled out over 6 hours because loyalty to his own enforcers' war left him standing on the wrong corner at the wrong moment. Some crowns get handed down for generations, worn thin by men who never earned the right to wear them. This one got buried on October 14th, 1986, at the corner of Roosevelt and Sacramento, in the same neighborhood that made Neil Wallace who he was, and in the 38 years since, across every leadership vote, every violent reshuffling, every new generation of traveling vice lords born after his death, nobody has ever been allowed to put it back on. The king is dead. Chicago's West Side has been calling him king ever since.